Thank you. Thank you very much. And at the very beginning, I would like to ask you for applause for our great MCs. They're doing a lot of great job. Let's give them that. That's good. So here is my catchy title for you to, get interested. And first of all, hello, I'm Kasia, and I'm front-end developer at Twill, which is a freight forwarding company based in Netherlands. And they're watching me now, so hello, Twillers. I'm also on Twitter. I tweet, not a lot, I promise you. I'm not flooding people with not very interesting materials. And a disclaimer, I would like to also say hello to Sarah, who's very jealous for me to be with you here in Sweden at the amazing Nordic.js conference. So hello, Sarah. OK, so let's talk a little bit more about styling. And when I say styling, I mean styling in React. So please raise your hand how many of you are using React. Oh, I love it. It's like full crowd. Awesome. And we used to say that CSS is hard, right? I know that many of you know this GIF, so it's actually like this in most cases. And when it comes to the React, we have few ways to manage our styles, our styling. So first, and still doable, is to use just plain CSS. That's fine. People do it all the time. What can I say? It has some pros and cons. Of course, we have all native features of CSS because it's just CSS. There's no build step. It's just simple and performant. But it's not very predictable. And when it comes to specificity, especially because we can actually use every selector we want and nest our selectors as much as we want. So it can get messy pretty quickly. And when it comes to React, I would say that it's not very React way of doing things. It's not very component-oriented. And CSS, as you probably know, is global. It has global scope. So even if we'll try to, let's say, manage our styles and attach CSS to every component on its own, we are still taking a risk of deleting some part of code, which will impact other part of our application. So yeah, for me, it's just a grumpy cat for plain CSS. We can, of course, combine plain CSS with naming conventions as BEM. We can apply SAS and less, which is also cool and brings even more features to our CSS. But there is one little problem with this solution. And it's not actually technology itself, because it's really good, and we can use it. You cannot enforce any convention on your developers. It's really hard, actually. So if your team agrees on something, on using BEM, for example, on naming conventions, on all of that, that's fine. Maybe it's going to work for you. But it's really, really hard, and from developer perspective and experience, I would say risky. There's also inline styling for React, as for the whole web development. But here is just a small comment from me. Don't do this. Why? Why? Because it just bothers me with breaking one of the most important rules of development, which is don't repeat yourself. OK, so we have CSS modules as well, which is cool. And I actually admire this way of attaching CSS to our React application. It's fine and works. And as you can see, I even have a lot of pros listed here for CSS modules as no name collisions, actually no naming problem at all, because all the names are generated for us. The CSS is local, it's just modular. We can manage it how we want by, for example, screens or modules or just components. And you can apply SAS or less, so JavaScript power is applied here. So it looks better. But it's still not perfect. It's still not perfect if we want to think about our components as universal components. So if we want to make our components reusable anywhere we want. So here's how we come to CSS-in-JS. Perfect. I really love this approach. I know that many front-end developers are not very convinced to this approach, and I totally understand you. It's something new. It's how React was new a few years ago. And this is how JS6 was new. It was really hard for many of us to understand how we can actually combine HTML with JavaScript, right? So this is how I see CSS-in-JS. When it comes to pros of this approach, as you probably know, it's more predictable and consistent. It's just keeping your styles as a function of the state of component and keeping your styles really close to your components, as close as possible, with only using classes, which names of classes are generated. The specificity problem is still there, right? Because it's still CSS under the hood, so we can still mess it up. But the problem is, in my opinion, lower. And of course, the power of JavaScript, but not only power of JavaScript to, for example, calculate some colors or sizes, but also power of JavaScript to use properties and state of our components. So let's try to compare and check out few libraries when it comes to CSS-in-JS. I picked up 4 of them, which are pretty stable, and some of them are pretty old when it comes to front-end development, because 2-year-old libraries, well, you nailed it. And then some of them are just very popular in the front-end development world when it comes to React. So first of all, vendor prefixes, as you probably know, is just supporting all the different needs of the browsers out there. And I also, when I think about the vendor prefixes, I also thought about just supporting native CSS here with some other JavaScript preprocessing. And as you can see, all of the libraries have it. And by now, actually, all of the CSS-in-JS libraries are trying to be fully compatible with all the native CSS features. But going further, atomic CSS. So how the CSS classes are generated in specific libraries here. As you can see, only Fela a library is generating the atomic CSS. And what is actually atomic CSS here means is that it means that every property of our CSS class is actually a single responsibility class. So if we, for example, create a class which will have font size and color and float, for example, Fela will generate us 3 classes which will be applied to our component, which is a very performant way of creating our CSS, because as you can probably imagine, there is just a finished number of combinations of CSS properties. So our CSS file will never grow up more than a certain point. So when it comes to agnostic library, it means that our library can be used not only with React, but also with other frameworks or just without any framework. As you can see, most of them are actually not really related to framework. We can use the binders to combine them with React, which is very cool when it comes to developer experience, because we don't want to learn for every framework another libraries, right? If it's possible, if it's doable, it's better to actually learn once and use everywhere. It's not very possible for styled components, because styled components are actually prepared to work for React, and it's kind of a React-focused library. But I hope that it's going to change soon. What about React Native support? Well, as you can see, all of the libraries have React Native support. Maybe just a disclaimer here, when it comes to Emotion, it's still in the development phase, sorry. But it's going to be soon. So all of those libraries are actually supporting React Native in different ways, maybe because styled components in Motion are trying to prepare for us primitives as view or layout. And when, for example, Aphrodite and Fella are just CSS objects applied to the elements. So the same with SSR support. Actually, this is something new, because when you try to compare CSS-in-JS libs with the plain CSS, it's ridiculous, right? Because plain CSS is just in there from the very beginning. But CSS-in-JS as a compiled by JS JavaScript CSS needs to have CSS SSR support to actually work blazing fast at the very first hit to your application. So let's try to compare the sizes of our libraries. And as you can see from the very beginning, the styled components one is the biggest. But it's mostly because styled components comes with the polished library, which is a Lodash for CSS. And it's awesome, trust me. And it contains many different methods for within API, which, for example, can count for you contrast colors, which is very good for accessibility issues. For example, when you want to support night readers in your application. OK, but what does it mean for us? Actually, nothing really, right? Because what's the most important thing is how it works in production. And the library size here doesn't really matter. But I can tell you that there are many performance checked out there for CSS-in-JS libraries. And I will actually share these links with you later on. But it looks really promising. And all of them are pretty the same fast. OK, so take a sneak peek on the code, how it looks for Fella as the first one. So Fella is a library, as you remember, which generates atomic CSS for us. But you don't really see this at the very beginning. It's just how the code is generated after all. But when it comes to creating components, it's just a simple API provided for us by Fella. And with the primitives, which, for example, button, which we apply rule to, CSS rule to, and that's it. I've created the code sandboxes for each of the libraries, so you can check it out later on. When it comes to Aphrodite, it's slightly different because we are using the objects to actually write the CSS code. And maybe that's not really nice in it from my personal perspective. But Aphrodite provides us a really fast and smooth way to actually create the whole style sheet and then just reuse the classes from there. That's the one way. Another way is to just extend your style sheet by the other classes just when you are creating your code. So when it comes to emotion, it's similar, but the CSS is created with the template literals, which provides us the experience of just writing CSS within our components. And it's more promising for me. And of course, React Emotion, which is a binder for React, comes with a helper to create React components with the styled API and bind the CSS to the newly created components. When it comes to styled components, it looks pretty the same, right? I mean, yeah, there was some inspiration between those libraries. So we have a styled button. We've applied CSS, which is creating for us a component. The styled is a hook, so higher order component under the hood. And what's more, the CSS is generated as a class which is attached to the head of the HTML. And that was it from me. So thank you very much. And,
thank you.
Thank you.